Hi, I'm Paul Guppy with the Washington Policy Center, and here's our regular update on issues that are affecting our state. As always, please like, share, subscribe, comment. We love that interaction with our audience. And as I've said before, I also love reading the comments. Positive, negative, it's okay. Say whatever you want about our videos. I love to see it. On this video, I'm going to tackle 6 issues. First is we're getting a slight inkling as to what Governor Ferguson might propose as a budget in the upcoming legislative session. I have some insight on that. Next is a study about Washington State losing taxpayers, how that's affecting us. New proposal for a high earners tax that's floating out there. Also, yet again, a proposal to reduce homelessness, primarily in Seattle, but also across the state. Also, some positive news, I think, for democracy on how voters responded at the ballot box this last election. And then finally, the open-ended question, is mail-in voting better? How is that serving our state? So let's just jump right into it right now. There are rumors, leaks, commentary coming out of the governor's office. This is reported by the Washington Observer, that Ferguson may be somewhat sensitive to overburdened taxpayers, and that his new budget, which he is required to propose, that's the start of the budget process, is just like at the federal level with the president. At the state level, the budget process starts with a proposal from the governor, which is introduced in the first part of January, and then the legislature takes it from there. Rumor has it that Ferguson will be proposing a budget that has no new tax revenue sources. That's not the same as saying that there are going to be no new taxes coming in, because the existing taxes are already producing a lot more revenue for the state. And yet you will hear continually this narrative, and even the Washington Observer says that the state is facing a, quote, giant shortfall. Oh no, even though the number of dollars going into the Treasury are increasing all the time. Why did they call it a shortfall? Because it's less than what the legislature wants to spend. Governor Ferguson kind of infamously now signed the largest tax increase in history. That was back in May. It's encouraging that he is showing some sensitivity and listening to overburdened taxpayers, and at least the governor is not starting the process by adding yet more new taxes on top of the ones that we're already paying. That is very positive. The Observer, I love their editorial style. It's always kind of softened things. They describe it that that Ferguson did not want taxes last year, and yet he did sign it, and that he was described as signing the new tax bill, doing it meekly, as if he was doing it reluctantly. Well, what difference does that make? I mean, I don't feel any better that the governor was reluctant in signing new taxes. The amount of money that the government is taking from us increased anyway. Also, from the legislature's point of view, they just wanted the new revenue. They wanted the taxes. They don't care whether the governor is reluctant, meek, shy, slow. Just as soon as he put pen to paper, our taxes went up. That's the result. I'm also seeing a pattern here. This is the second legislative session with our new Governor Ferguson. In the last session, he gave a very open-minded, bipartisan speech, reaching across the aisle to Republicans, trying to get the minority and the majority to work together in our legislature. Then, towards the end of the session, all that bipartisanship had evaporated. No initiatives proposed by Republicans, including a balanced no new taxes budget, was considered seriously by the legislature, and we ended up with a very partisan result. Now we are seeing something of the same pattern. Ferguson, who's to be complimented, starting off, no new taxes, he wants to be kind of open, but it could be that he talks one way in January and then talks a different way in March, April, or May when the legislative session ends. The only thing that matters is results. Next issue is a new study come out by the National Taxpayers Union looking at all 50 states. And one of the results about that that's worrying for us is Washington State is losing taxpayers. I've mentioned this before. Our state, I think, is moving into the category of states like California, Illinois, New York State that are losing population. That could affect our congressional representation in the future, but in the short term, it means that we are losing working families, productive people, small business owners, larger businesses, investors. Everyone who is contributing to the economy and paying taxes is gradually, the trend is moving out of the state. That is net interstate migration is working against us. According to the National Taxpayers Union, we rank 43rd at the bottom in the nation in terms of losing population or the inability to retain our working population, working families. And that results in us losing a taxpayer about once every 30 minutes, according to the National Taxpayers Union. So that does not bode well for revenue going into the government. We constantly hear about how the budget is a moral document. That is certainly true. The moral part of it, however, may be the impact on taxpayers. Is it right for the government to take so much of your earnings, so much of your profits? When people feel like their voice is not being heard regarding the financial burden, what other option do they have? They're going to tend to move to jurisdictions that take less of their money. The same study showed that Florida gains about 2 taxpayers every minute. Texas, Tennessee, Arizona, other states that have lower taxes are attracting people, attracting investors, and Washington State is at the losing end of that trend. Lastly is a quote from the study that I like. It says, taxpayers want to live in states that do not treat them as an endless source of funding for politicians. That's common sense. Again, when people get frustrated, they don't advertise that. I mean, most people do not go on Facebook and say, I'm moving out of the state because I've had it with the taxes. They might, they talk to their friends and families, but this is not a trend that's picked up in the media until you dig into the data, which is what the Taxpayers Union did. Next issue is what I call Representative Sean Scott did not get the memo. He has already indicated that he wants to introduce a high wealth tax in the legislature starting in January. I expect that will definitely happen. I look forward to reading the bill so I can see how it compares with the high wealth tax that Seattle has already put in place. And the reason for that is, as a researcher, you always want to look at real world models or examples that are working out there because that data is reliable. The high wealth tax in Seattle has already hurt the city. Businesses are moving mostly to Bellevue. So here are some quick examples. Amazon has moved about 14,000 employees to Bellevue. TikTok just signed a lease for 450,000 square feet of commercial space there. So that's activity that's not happening in Seattle. And then Seattle's commercial vacancy rate is around 35%. So these are all market indicators that people are voting with their feet, moving outside of Seattle. If a high wealth tax goes in on top of our high property taxes, high sales tax, our capital gains income tax that we have, all of that adds up to people making a decision, again, to move out of the state. There's a sense of denial in Olympia that this is happening. And, they're kind of whistling past the graveyard, right? They just don't talk about it. Instead, there's a lot of happy talk in Olympia about how great Washington State is, how generous our benefits are, without ever thinking about, again, morally and ethically, as to when is the government taking their fair share? Like, when are they done taking a portion of your income and your earnings for themselves? And the answer, at least in Olympia, is we're not there yet. So I would expect more taxes to be proposed. Next is, I was listening to an interview by Seattle's mayor-elect, Katie Wilson. She calls herself a democratic socialist. I don't think that bodes well for quality of life in the city. But in particular, it's interesting to a politician to once again make promises about solving the homeless problem. She said the metric is getting people off the streets, that people are to reduce the number of people who are sleeping on the streets in Seattle. And by extension, this applies to other communities across the state. Well, that makes perfect sense. That's a policy goal that everyone wants. But what I notice about the new mayor is that I think of it that she was rocking 2005. This is exactly the same promise that was made by every single previous Seattle mayor, including the one that she just defeated, Bruce Harrell. So I wouldn't expect there to be much of a change. It reminded me of kind of great golden oldies on homelessness, which was in 2005, Seattle announced with enormous hoopla that they were going to end homelessness in 10 years. Look how that worked out. In 2015, Seattle leaders announced that homelessness was an emergency and had to be taken care of immediately. And then the other one, which is, moving deck chairs around on the Titanic, as they say, moving boxes, is they created a King County-wide homeless authority, which consumed millions of dollars and didn't accomplish anything. The bottom line is that Seattle tends to call itself, and of course most communities like to think of themselves this way, as a compassionate city that cares for its citizens. Okay, everyone's entirely in favor of that. But I can tell you from my own experience living in the city that when you see someone who is disoriented, suffering, needs medical assistance, acting out on the streets, the city will do nothing for that person. They may offer services, but fundamentally, and I've experienced this myself, you call 911 and they're like, is that person a direct threat to people? Well, no, but he clearly needs medical help. He needs some assistance and services. They they don't always come. I'll put it that way. And so I think that the city leaders, although they talk about compassion, they actually allow people to suffer on the streets. They don't do involuntary commitment. They won't require people to get services along with housing. And as long as that's the case, I think it's going to continue this pattern of new politicians, mayors like Katie Wilson, promising the sky in terms of helping the homelessness, but not actually helping reduce the problem. Okay, enough of a tirade about that. I know that issue is controversial and can go on forever, but I just think we should apply some common sense in really helping our fellow human beings who are on the street, like get it done. And we'll see how Mayor Wilson does on that. Next is moving on to what I call positive democracy. And by that, I mean there were some ballot measures in unexpected places that were defeated. One is in Olympia, there was a minimum wage increase that voters voted down. I think that even in left-leaning Olympia, voters realized, again, from a compassionate point of view, that a super high minimum wage is a job killer and cuts off opportunities for young workers, unskilled workers, migrants, people who are trying to get their foot in the door. It just kills jobs. And so that measure was defeated, even in Olympia. Next is in wealthy Mercer Island, voters there voted down a construction bond. Again, sends a positive signal to the leaders on Mercer Island that checkbooks are not endlessly open. The reason I say that's positive for democracy is because that is the only voice that politicians listen to, is when voters go to the ballot box every once in a while and they just simply say no. And at that point, politicians realize that all of their narrative and happy talk and everything like that didn't make any difference. So the endless pitching on these ballot measures tends to be all vote yes, and with very little no campaign on the other side. And yet when voters do say no, I think that sends, again, a healthy signal to our elected leaders. Last issue is I did some research to see whether mail-in voting is working for Washington State. There's this kind of negative attack against anybody who questions our voting method. I'm completely neutral about it. I love the way wonky democratic processes work. There are dozens of democracies across the world. The United States is a coalition of 50 republics that every state has a different kind of democracy, different ways of voting. And to me, the technical ways of voting are very interesting. No two countries have the same electoral system. So I just look at this from a political science point of view. With mail-in voting in Washington State, I went back and looked at the promises that were made when we started. One of the primary promises was by making voting easier, you can do it at home, you can vote weeks in advance, that's going to increase the participation rate. Participation has ticked up and down depending on what election year it is and who's on the ballot, usually nationally, tends to drive turnout. And yet participation is not higher than it was when we had in-person voting. In 2004, when we had in-person voting, participation was 82%. In this last election, 2004 general presidential election, statewide election, the participation rate was 79%. So it actually ticked down. Also, it doesn't take into account that there are many benefits from in-person voting, which are an advantage in other states that we don't have. The main one is fast results. Same day announcing, real-time counting of ballots as they are cast produces higher confidence for the public when election results are announced the same day or the next day. It is now common in our system. We do not have an election day anymore. It goes on for weeks, but more suspiciously, counting goes on for weeks, days, weeks afterwards. This just happened in the Seattle's mayor's race. Again, not necessarily a partisan race because everybody running in it was a Democrat, but the incumbent mayor was ahead on election day by 8%. And as the days went by, that changed gradually, and the other, Katie Wilson, the other candidate, won. This pattern is repeated all the time. So I see that as a flip. You have one result on election day, and then as more ballots come in through the mail, we have rules like ballots can be counted as they come in late, things like that. The result flips. So the advantage of in-person voting is getting a quick result, solid confidence, people know how it came out, and there isn't all this waiting. But I'll leave that for people to debate. There are arguments on both sides. But what I really object to is the kind of cancel culture that forbids you from talking about the issue. I've run into that a lot. It's like, nope, can't talk about voting, conspiracy, you're a bad person. And just from an intellectual point of view, I object to anyone who tries to silence others by saying, you may not talk about that topic. And we've seen a lot of that on different issues over the recent years, and elections is one of those. I always think we should be open to hearing a diversity of views about elections or any other topic. I think that's just important for our the health of our civic communities. Let me wrap up there. I'll mention that we have our On the Go event coming next Tuesday on December 9th. David Bose, our host, will be having a guest, Andrew Wilford from the National Taxpayers Union. They did that study that I just mentioned about taxpayers leaving the state. And we also have our Young Professionals organization is holding Christmas parties, which are going to be a lot of fun, December 10th in Seattle and December 17th in Spokane. If you're in the area, please feel welcome to join one of those. And with that, I'll wrap up, and I'll be back next time. Thanks for listening.
If you found this informative, share it with a friend and consider checking out one of our suggested videos over here. Make sure you're subscribed so that you can stay up to date with the latest policy news from Washington.